There are debates on the true origins of theater in British America. For some reason, people didn't think it entirely necessary to keep accurate records of every single theatrical performance that took place in all 13 disconnected colonies. Nevertheless, early American theater was influenced by Europe, especially Britain.
In 1752, a troupe led by a man named Lewis Hallam, which contained his family and 10 actors unrelated to him, docked on the shores of Virginia and began their nomadic theatrical crusade across cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Their first performance was on the Livingston stage in Williamsburg, performing The Merchant of Venice and The Anatomist. After their tour of the colonies, they decided to take their shows somewhere more exotic, and Hallam moved his family to Jamaica.
He would die there, however, and his wife would remarry and move the company back into the Americas, settling them down in New York under the name The American Company in 1758.
In 1767, the first tragedy written by an American-born author, a show by Thomas Godfrey entitled The Prince of Parthia, would be performed at Philadelphia's Southwark Theater.
The Hallam family's American Company would officially begin professional theater in the colonies, and professional theaters would begin popping up all over the place around the colonies after that. However, American theater would soon suffer a swift death at the hands of the newly formed American government. The Continental Congress was not fond of the performances of shows written by British playwrights or inspired by British works, as they believed they pushed tyrannical British beliefs. However, the voices of playwrights could not be silenced, only hushed.
Some playwrights, like John Leacock, sought to document the events of the war through the lens of American glory. Others, like Hugh Henry Brackenridge, attempted to help the cause by glorifying American battles and beliefs. Women were not out of the picture either. Mercy Otis Warren used her talents to create political satires bashing British loyalists. Then, there were those like Robert Munford, who sought to satirize the whole thing and not take anything too seriously. Or, in the case of his work, The Patriots, even criticized the American government for their overzealous patriotism, despite being in support of the Revolution and fighting alongside the Americans in the war.
American theatrical works through the Revolutionary War were, whether through necessity or desire, heavily bent around the Revolution. Interestingly, Munford's 1771 work, The Candidates, or The Humors of a Virginia Election, was the first American drama to feature a black character in the form of a boy named Ralpho. After the war, theater initially suffered. Throughout most of the 1780s and half of the 1790s, theater companies, such as the American Company, which would rebrand itself as the Old American Company in the 1790s, mostly tried older shows that could guarantee an audience, as the newer, riskier shows threatened them with poverty due to the post-war economic insecurity.
In 1787, a man named Royal Tyler witnessed the American Company's production of The School for Scandal. This inspired Tyler to write his own play, and he produced his first work within a month of the initial viewing of the American Company's production. He called his new show The Contrast, and it was produced by the American Company themselves. This became the first American-written comedy to be performed by an American theater company.
However, as the 18th century drew to a close, theater once again rose in popularity. The Depression resolved itself, the economy grew stable, and the theater business grew bigger than it ever had been, making it more popular than it ever had before. William Dunlap is known as the first professional American playwright. He wrote many plays with the intent of them being performed by the Old American Company. In his work there, he met a British-born man named John Hodgkinson, whom he took notice of.
The two would open their own theater, titled the Park Theater, in 1798, where Dunlap would showcase his magnum opus. This show was known as Andre, which is a tragedy based upon the story of Major John Andre, a British spy during the Revolutionary War who was met with a cruel fate by hanging due to his attempts to turn over an American fort to the British.
The lead role, the titular Major John Andre, was performed by Hodgkinson. This made him rather famous among theatergoers and hoisted him into stardom, making him the first famous American actor. However, New York City was not the only place where theater was alive in the 18th century.
Boston saw its own famous Haymarket Theater, built in 1797, where John Dally Burke's Bunker Hill, or The Death of General Warren, was performed. It was a 5-act tragedy, influenced heavily by patriotic views in battles. It included a battle scene containing armies, real cannon fire, and a military band, which had never been seen before, or since really.
As the 19th century came about, the theater business would spread all across the United States, and as the frontier was created, adventurous men would also take the theater business out west.
Samuel Drake pioneered this movement, bringing his own theater company to Kentucky in 1815. He would create the Louisville Theater, which many believed to be overkill, as there were far fewer people in the West than in New York, where he'd come from, to see his productions. Nevertheless, he persisted with his ambition and bred the first signs of professional theater on the frontier.
The heart of American theater, however, remained New York City. Many theaters opened up in the city, including the Bowery Theater, which one-upped Dunlap and Hodgkinson's 2,000-seat Park Theater with 3,000 seats, dethroning what had previously been the king of theaters in New York City. By the way, Although there were theaters on Broadway, the term Broadway theater as it's used today was not coined yet.
These theaters were relatively disgusting, rat-infested, and under constant threat of going up in flames. In a span of 25 years, from 1820 to 1845, a theater burnt to a crisp at least once per year due to terrible fire safety regulations.
However, this did not stop people from performing. One man, John Howard Payne, was a boy of just 16 when he made his theatrical debut. He was incredibly talented, and was even noticed by William Dunlap himself, who commented on Payne's attractive appearance and his skill in acting. However, he would suffer a hit to his popularity and be forced into playwriting. Most famously, he wrote the song Home Sweet Home for the opera Clary Maid of Milan, which would go on to be used as a war chant by both the Confederacy and the Union in the Civil War 40 years later.
In the middle of the 19th century, the theater made many strides in innovation. Stages that were previously exclusively candlelit, the likely culprit of the rampant theater fires at the time, were replaced with gaslight and limelight, which was an early prototype of what would become spotlight.
This was also the evolution of novel-to-stage adaptations, beginning in 1821 with The Spy, but extending into such influential novels as Uncle Tom's Cabin and Rip Van Winkle.
After the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, nationalism took off in the United States, which extended into theater.
The old European writing tropes of Romanticism would be blended with American patriotism and nationalism to breed stories with democratic and populist themes. As the 19th century went on, theater began to change even more. Prior to the mid-19th century, theater was relatively looked down upon.
Actors and actresses were seen as sinful and unrefined, and those that attended were seen as uncouth and uncivilized. However, during the mid-19th century, theaters underwent a metamorphosis that changed public perception.
Theaters not only tried to have the most seats, but also tried to be the most beautiful. In the 1850s and 60s, new theaters were built to be gorgeous and awe-inspiring in their decor, architecture, and scale, thus attracting higher-class patrons and shifting the perception of theatergoers and actors alike. Acting quickly became very demanding on performers, as actors would be acting in dozens, if not hundreds, of plays every season. This created an environment where men and women were essentially equal.
They traveled together, slept together, starved together, suffered pay cuts together, and most importantly, performed together. Men and women in the acting business were not all that different, which broke down gender roles more than anything else that existed in wider society.
While performers were paid decent salaries for the time, they still didn't make all that much. Beginners could expect around $3 to $6 per week, while the biggest of stars could demand up to $500 per week. Speaking of stars, many stars rose before, during, and after the Civil War, which ended up having very little effect on theatrical performances, especially in the North.
One of the most famous stars at the time was a man by the name of Edwin Booth, who began acting as a child thanks to his father being an actor, and he became renowned in the 1850s and 60s for his acting. Notoriously, Edwin's brother, John Wilkes, was the man who assassinated President Abraham Lincoln at the Ford Theater on April 14, 1865.
Another star named James O'Neill played his role as Jesus in a show titled The Passion Play so well that people reportedly sank to their knees and prayed to him whenever he would go out and walk around the city. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century came in, what we now know as a modern musical came to be.
Although operas, plays, and dance performances had existed for millennia, to combine acting, dancing, and singing had never truly been done before.
The rise of musicals brought about the golden age of Broadway, and thus led us down the road to what we now know as modern theater. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. I mean, it was a small journey through such a large expanse of time. There's plenty I couldn't cover, there's plenty I missed, and there's most likely so much that was never documented in the first place. I mean, the history of theater and theater as a whole is so rich and incredible, and I can never hope to document it in one video. But thank you for sticking through this throughout however long this ends up being, and have a good day. Uncle Tom's Replicant Finger. What'd you just say? wait.
Uncle Tom. Maybe your Uncle Tom's a rip.
Hold on. I'll just give you a second.